Hi there, this is Solitaire Ronan from Solitaire Ronan Films, and welcome to another random review. Today's random review features a Powerhouse Indicator title. I know, not another one, but it's 1975's The Fortune, directed by Mike Nichols, starring Jack Nicholson, Warren Beatty and Stockard Channing. And this is an odd little film. It's kind of a perfect indicator film for those of you who, like me, who love indicator. This is a perfect indicator film. It perhaps doesn't quite work, but there's lots to like about it, and there's lots to kind of look at in repeated viewings. This was made in 1975, so Mike Nichols has kind of had a run of success with Graduate and things like that. But this film was a bit of a disaster. Nobody really liked it. It didn't really find an audience. So Mike Nichols didn't make another film for 7 years. He went back to theatre. This was also made the same year as One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which obviously was a huge thing for Jack Nicholson. One of the issues is perhaps because it's a farce. And both the lead actors are pretty much playing it up to 11. You could argue they perhaps go a little bit too far. Warren Beatty gives a performance that's very similar, or reminds me of George Clooney in Oh Brother Where Art Thou. He even adopts a kind of gruffer voice for the whole film. It's a strange little setup based on an act that actually existed in the 20s in America called the Mann Act, about how a woman would have to be accompanied by a guardian or be married to cross state lines to kind of eliminate promiscuity or something. So that's kind of the basis for this. So Jack Nicholson and Warren Beatty are kind of partners, more on that later, and they kind of hatch this scheme that Jack Nicholson will marry Stockard Channing, but Warren Beatty's the one who actually has feelings for her, and then we find out that she's an heiress and they're hoping to get the money that's coming to her on her birthday. It is kind of weird because the film is called The Fortune, but the money and stuff like that isn't really talked about that much. So you can see why it didn't really find an audience. Because again, there's no central heist, there's a kind of a mention of the money, but that's not really the focus of the film. A lot of Mike Nichols' film is more about the character and the interactions and the relationships and the kind of love triangle that kind of happens between the three characters. The extras, as with all indicator titles, are really good. Obviously get a nice booklet, Warren Beatty's big face. You get an audio commentary with Nick Pinkerton. You get Mike Nichols and Elaine May in conversation from 2006, which is 69 minutes, which is wonderful as they chat after watching Ishtar. Professor Kyle Stevens has a 6-minute filmed appreciation from 2017. And he wrote a book on Mike Nichols. And there's isolated music effects, score, which they do, and obviously a nice booklet. But Kyle Stevens talks about the perhaps kind of latent homosexuality between Nicholson and Beatty's characters. Stockard Channing makes a point that they're both kind of more interested in each other than herself. I mean, they both have like arguments, like couples bickering, and only when Stockard Channing starts wearing her hair short and dressing like a boy does Jack Nicholson become kind of sexually interested in her. So there's kind of like undercurrents going on. The film, like I said, doesn't quite work, but I think on repeated viewings I'm probably going to like it more. There's so much going on, and I think one of the issues, because there's so many scenes, that there's so much going on, the three characters are shouting at each other, talking over each other, it can be a little bit annoying, to be honest. But there's also scenes that work really well. Again, Warren Beatty puts on a gruff voice, and he is a lot zanier. Jack Nicholson, 5 years before The Shining, his hair's out to here. He almost goes like full Jack Torrance, pulling faces in this film, which must have given him practice for The Shining. There's a wonderful scene, you know, Empire magazine in the UK, when it used to be good and an interesting read, would have like a classic scene kind of breakdown. And for me, the classic scene in The Fortune is Stockard Channing, who knows nothing about cooking or baking, is quite upfront about that, prepares breakfast for Nicholson and Beatty, and Mike Nichols just shoots it in a single shot. Stockard Channing's messing about in the kitchen doing some physical stuff, and Beatty and Nicholson are on either side of the kitchen table looking at this food, which even from the kind of mid shot we can see looks absolutely disgusting. And both of them spend the whole scene pulling funny faces and trying to work out what this food is, occasionally trying to taste some of it. And again, I can see why some people might not get it or might not like it, because they do go full on farce, perhaps taking it too far at times. But it's just a wonderful scene. I mean, other filmmakers would have done close-ups and kind of chopped the scene up, but Nichols just leaves the camera there, so you can actually watch the scene 2 or 3 times and just focus on what Warren Beatty's doing. You can focus on what Jack Nicholson's doing. You can focus on what Stockard Channing's doing in the background. It's just a wonderful scene, beautifully done. I mean, again, I haven't listened to the commentary yet. Maybe it tells us how many takes it took. But you can see all 3 actors are just having a whale of a time. There's even a moment where Jack Nicholson almost does his rat face from The Departed, from much later on in his career, when his career became a lot less interesting. But it's just a wonderful scene that, again, in the hands of a different director, would have probably made it less interesting, but he just lets the actors go to work. You could argue sometimes that's to the detriment of the film, because they're doing too many funny faces at times. You'll have Warren Beatty in the foreground of a shot, and you'll have Jack Nicholson just like making bizarre, pulling funny faces like behind him. So it's a film that I would recommend, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's a great film. It is a classic indicator release. I think it's well worth repeated viewings, and like I said, I think once you get into the joke and once you get into the rhythm of the piece, I think it will just get better. But obviously, if you're a Jack Nicholson fan, it's perhaps a film that's kind of been forgotten about, because I wasn't really aware of it until Indicator released it and I picked this up. It's kind of one of Mike Nichols' most forgotten films. You can kind of see why. It's only 88 minutes, and you do feel that perhaps there's some parts of the story missing. Again, the fortune isn't really mentioned that much. The act itself, the man act, there's only Warren Beatty just gives a brief bit of exposition. There's a kind of pre-credits scroll about the man act, but it's really just an excuse to have a farce involving these three characters. It's a lot of fun, even at the same time as being a little bit frustrating. Nazar and Prod did a video a while ago about 10 films that should work but don't, and this perhaps would be a candidate. I mean, Mike Nichols, Jack Nicholson, Warren Beatty, Stockard Channing, Scatman Crothers turns up for a scene, Christopher Guest, a very young Christopher Guest, turns up for a scene. It's shot by John Alonzo, who did Chinatown and Vanishing Point, and lots of films, one of the great American cinematographers. But it doesn't quite, it's not quite as good as it should be. But again, I think the more times I watch it, it will go up in my estimations, and it's kind of, it has kind of cult film written all over it. I mean, because of Alonso's cinematography, it does look beautiful. It really captures 1920s West United States. Again, Nicholson and Beatty are just having a lot of fun, perhaps too much fun. Yeah, so I'd recommend it, but don't expect a masterpiece or anything. But again, it's in the eye of the beholder. You might absolutely adore it and think it's perfect. But that's The Fortune. Indicator, spine number 71. A really interesting little film that perhaps doesn't quite land, but well worth checking out. So thanks very much for watching. Please let me know in the comments below whether you've seen The Fortune and what you think of it. And hopefully you'll see me again for more random reviews. This is Solitaire Ronin from Solitaire Ronin Films saying farewell.